The Joining the Dots podcast focuses on the many challenges facing education and how different approaches and innovations are needed to meet those challenges.
Join co-hosts Matt Jessup and Elle Kingsley as they have discussions with innovative educators, business leaders, policymakers, and other stakeholders, and guests looking at transforming the future of education.
It's always good when the guests try not to laugh on the intro tune, Bianca. So
I thought it was a lovely intro
to
tune.
contain a smile.
I don't know what you're talking about. It was lovely.
Yeah, you see in your face, Jessup.
Yeah, I know. All right, I'll show up. Morning, Bianca. So I sort of wrote a nice introduction for Bianca that was very visionary CEO, founder of AI Edify, history teacher, digital leader down at a school in Hampton. I think you're pursuing a master's degree at Oxford University. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. Because I don't have enough on my hands, of course. But I finish in September.
No. But I think the reason I sort of follow you so much on LinkedIn is because you come up with the odd post, and you're not after attention, which some may be, or you're not. But you're very insightful. And I think ethics, personalised learning, and the legalities of AI, things that I've sort of I've saved your posts about that. So you're very well informed at that end of the scale as well.
Yeah, I think everything I post or everything I do, because I am in the classroom, I find that everything's based on how much I care about the pupils that I teach. And as well as that, I've got a little boy and I want to ensure that what we're doing, when he grows up, when he goes to school, that there are voices out there that are thinking not just about, ed tech or technology or what the world might look like, but actually, what's the person going to look like? What's my little boy going to be exposed to as he goes through the school system? So I think it's incredibly important to have voices that say, actually, this stuff is all great. There's lots of opportunity, but what impact is it going to have on our children? And not just for children who are leaving school now when we say sixth form, but what about our young people who are entering primary school, who are going to grow up having a vastly different experience? And what does that mean for their thinking? What does it mean for their socialization? What does it mean for their learning?
Do you think there's an element of I sometimes think AI has been a really handy catalyst to reflect on things that we could have, should have on other topics in education. So I always think AI is highlighting now these risks and how we need to think about our digital citizenship and how we maintain the right ethics within the technology we use for our learners. And then you kind of think, shouldn't we have been doing more of that 5-10 years ago? Shouldn't we be doing that on the advent of access to the internet and children's access to social media and the movement of a tablet and a phone into a child's hands? Kind of just skip that and either put it just on parental responsibility or on the moral responsibility of platform providers that frankly don't care.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think one of the concerns is that everyone's kind of gone gung-ho when it comes to technology. And, I look at it, I didn't have a phone until I was 16. So I didn't have that in my formative years. But I think there's been so much technology, so much social media. And I think we're only really seeing the impact of social media now. So when we think about things like AI technology, it should have been debated. There should have been regulations and there should have been, ethics considerations before it was introduced, as opposed to retrospective. And unfortunately, I think that's what's happening now again. And it would be good if, as an education system, we could look at it and think, instead of, kind of putting out small fires, as it were, why don't we have a look at our education system and think, how are we going to...
Listen, I'm with you. I think we just lost you there, Bianca. We just got a bit of a crackle on that recording. What I was just going to ask you is, because I absolutely agree in it, and I think most people whose heart's in doing it for the right reason, I hope, is in the same place. But there's going to be a question, a critical friend challenge from the outside looking within, saying we absolutely need to be legislating ahead of the curve, not after the problems occurred, because that's often the challenge. But isn't that what education's often really bad at? Being ahead of the curve? Don't we always tend to look back for evidence and research to justify our forward thinking?
Yeah, I think inherently, I think that schools, educators, education systems, I believe that people try really hard I think, unfortunately, the execution is not as up to date as we need it to be. And I think a lot of that is because, everything seems to infiltrate through business. So when we think about change, it's very much, well, how do we change things based on the career choices that are going forward, or the skills in the workplace, as opposed to cultivating the learner? So it doesn't seem as though when we're thinking about modernisation, there seems to be less impact when it comes to changing systems on bottom up in terms of ages and learning theory, and more in terms of, what's the workplace saying, right, we must respond.
I mean, you say you've got a 2-year-old, Bianca. Have you tried to sort of think ahead? So when your 2-year-old lad leaves primary school at 11, can we possibly have any concept of what education is going to look like, or is it still going to look the same in England?
I mean, I have quite a few ideas in terms of what I think it might look like, what I think it should look like. But one of my biggest concerns is that by the time he leaves primary school, it might actually look exactly the same, but with a whole host of more challenging things around it. What my concern is that we're going to be building kind of not changing our infrastructure, not changing our methods, but in fact, we carry on exactly how it is, but with a lot of initiatives around the outside that are trying to protect our children instead of actually changing or amending and taking it from the educationalist approach. So I would love to say that I think that by the time my little boy gets to the end of primary school, things might look different, but actually I don't think they will, not here.
No, I think we have this conversation with many of our guests. There's a will, but a way to deliver it is a challenge, particularly as we tend to be geared for evidence-informed approaches. And when we come to the advent of something new, there's a disconnect there. What seems to be a common theme that everybody we talk to references is that whilst we talk about AI and we talk about technology and we see this massive and rapid change, actually the change that's needed in the system is educator, children, parent skills, safety, the effective use of technology, actually recognizing that it's the human aspect that's most important and those human skills, and that maybe what we see with the advent of AI, something I know Matt's very passionate about, is it changed the weighting of what skills we want to acquire as human beings and what we want to end our educational journey equipped with for that new world that you see. So maybe the place and space of education might look remarkably similar because we're not good at change, but just maybe what we do within those bricks and mortars might change in terms of that balance between what actually we need. That's the fingers crossed bit. I mean, again, I'm sharing a perspective we've seen consistently, and I know Matt and I firmly believe in, but I'm very interested in where you see that balance coming from.
I think what's quite tricky is because I think when we look at government guidance, for example, the rhetoric being pushed out, it's all about efficiency as opposed to deep learning, and I think that's where there's this discord. Don't get me wrong, AI does save time, and it saved me a vast amount of time and a lot of different tasks that I've done. But I think if the rhetoric is very much about teacher efficiencies, I think that's where we're actually, it's quite tricky because it shouldn't be about efficiencies. Don't get me wrong, it's a lovely bonus. But when I'm teaching, I'm not using AI to make my job faster. I want to use it so that I become a better teacher. And that's where I think there's a bit of an issue here, is you're not going to get meaningful change if it's based on efficiency savings.
I think this is a really, really, I love the fact you've just touched on that. There's a really underlying challenge here, which is the sustainability of education in England, and you would suggest perhaps in all of the home nations, has a prerequisite of a consolidation of the education system to make it financially viable. And whilst we have this pressure on the school system and we don't have enough teachers and we have this thing that we don't talk about enough in terms of the recruitment and retention problem, it's really easy to say the solution, the panacea to everything, is technology will free up teacher time. And if teacher time's freed up, they'll magically fill the void and the gap we've got, without recognizing what we want is we want the best teachers who actually are trying to do a reasonable workload, but spending that human to human quality time. But that comes partly from every initiative when it comes to strategy for AI rollout, and I'm a fan when used with purpose. That's the key bit that often gets missed. But every conversation is led by, sponsored by Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and we have to remember that this isn't necessarily a level playing field. There is definitely a fox guarding the chickens when it comes to the conversations around how quickly we adopt AI and what we magically want it to fix. So I know your focus, for example, and it's something where there is starting to be evidence with work that's done, is around that pedagogy-led edtech, where digital's used with a pedagogical purpose. Do you think it's perhaps because we're not confident enough with the use of AI, we're starting on the easy stuff? That's what I see, the time-saving bits, resource, drafting and curation, rather than how it can be used.
Lesson plan and,
yeah, rather than the pedagogical, weaving it into how it could add value in terms of the classroom. Or maybe we're still at that point where the evidence of the real value impact isn't there. I mean, we all argue about the cognitive benefit or not. Does it stop you thinking? Doesn't it stop you thinking? Does it lead us to project-based learning? The list goes on, doesn't it?
It turns into quite a vicious cycle. I think the easy entry is efficiency, but then it allows people to assume that the biggest benefit is then efficiency. So then they'll keep using it for that. So then you have more tools which are then tailored to efficiency. And I don't actually think it then gives the space for educators to really evaluate, well, what can I do with this? Because you tend to go by the rhetoric, unless you're ones who are, more early adopters or just more exploratory in their nature or have the space or time to explore. I think once the rhetoric's out there, and that's the difficulty we're in now, is, a lot of people, if you say AI, will say efficiency, money saving, redundancies, all that kind of thing when it comes to the business world. And actually, there's so much that it can do in terms of deep learning, and it's helped me so much because I use it as something that interrogates me, something that will, add ideas when I've hit a wall, something that I can say, I've thought about this. What am I missing here? How do I round this out? What have I underestimated? Or what biases might I have? What implicit assumptions might I be making? And that's using it very differently to, I've got a lesson period 5 on this and I don't know what I'm doing, and, my last lesson was a bit stale, so provide me something. It's vastly different.
We need more Biancas. The problem is, whenever you have, particularly in England, the trust leadership conversations right now, it does swing to where are the cost savings, the efficiencies, the impact on recruitment and retention, the financial bits, because 70% are running at deficit budgets, and the natural, I would argue trust leadership, the business, the commercial considerations are how do we find ways to be more efficient? And that's the pinch point, which is efficiencies are supposed to be to free up more time to do the really quality human to human teaching. But sometimes people kind of take efficiencies as a replace for, and that's where I think we miss the point and don't spend the time then, as you articulated there, Bianca, thinking about actually how can I do it to support deeper thinking, better teaching and learning. I can weave it into my own professional development in different ways. And for some people, that even starts with even understanding that they can use it in an iterative way rather than a one-stop search engine approach to research.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that I think is also a bit concerning is when you have new teachers coming into the profession, for example. There's a different base of knowledge in terms to evaluate what the output look like, and I think that's something that needs to be considered as well when we think about teacher usage and all of these ways that you can use AI. I think the people coming into the profession need extra support as well, because when you've been teaching for a while, what makes your class essentially, and it's very much you work with your understanding of the people in the room. And it's also based on however many years of experience you have. But when it comes to, you new teachers who don't have that experience to fully evaluate what might work in that context, it then becomes more challenging and they are robbed of that opportunity to learn and to create themselves.
Can I ask a question, Bianca, then? So Al's alluded to this with the Google, Microsoft, I forget what word you used, Al, but the power and the influence they have. And when we look back to the purpose of education was started to provide workers for rich folk, if it would be one very, very, very blunt way of putting it in some respects, when you go back to the 1800s. At the moment now, you did a post, one of my favourite posts the past year or so, about personalised learning. There's a big focus on personalised learning. And the question was, well, actually, who's personalising it? Because if it's a platform of some sort, or if it's a school, then they are actually restricting that in many, many ways, if not always. So it's not personalised by the learner, it's personalised by the actual people at the company. So how do you see, what do you see the purpose of education being within that in the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh, that's a big question, the purpose of education.
It is a huge question.
It's a pretty big
I want an answer. I want somebody to give me an answer, because I can't think of one myself.
The things, I think, if you can look at it from many perspectives, part of it is, do we create, I suppose, good citizens when we're thinking about education and some sort of symbiosis? Are we creating people when we think about intelligence? Are we thinking about socialization? I think a good education system looks at, the kind of people we want to create in society. And so I think when it comes to education, I'd like an education system that creates people who are kind, that are thoughtful, that think deeply, that have compassion, that are resilient, that can, face the world undaunted, as it were. And that's what I think education should be. Now, what education is, unfortunately, is I don't think it's a lot of those things. I think there's a lot of assessment points that I think are outdated. And I think that there's, class sizes are too big. I don't see how we can create what good education looks like and how to cultivate these children and support them with what we have at the moment. And I think that's what is a big concern. So in terms of what is education for, I think it should be to create kind, compassionate young people who are able to engage with the current affairs that are going on today, but also be able to, make decisions from an informed, evaluative approach with a degree of insightfulness as well.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, Matt? Because I would argue the word that always springs to mind is about giving people agency and giving them the ability and the skills to flourish in their adult lives. And from an education perspective, we're all about developing the whole child. It's about their well-being, their enjoyment, their love of learning, giving them the skills to allow them to flourish independent. But it's not unreasonable, not quite perhaps going back to the 1870s, but it's not quite unreasonable for a country, a society to say, also, one of the purposes of education is to provide a skilled workforce to allow our country to continue to develop and flourish and provide economical powerhouse that feeds into our social welfare and all the rest of it. And that's sometimes where I think you don't need to go much beyond just, we have to have an ear to the labour market information. We have to have an ear to what future employers want, even if we're guessing at the moment. The problem is we shouldn't do that at the expense of a child's development and flourishing and breadth of learning and skills acquisition and agency, which you could argue, if we went, and we've talked about it a few times, we went across to the PISA rankings and those highest on the list, sometimes that's at the expense of the broader child and much more, I believe, on the narrowing of the child. And that's a debate that I'm sure there's plenty in an average room would say, I agree with you, and plenty would say, hell no, Al. But, I think that's where we have this problem finding a balance.
Yeah, I think that's just it. There should be a balance. And I think currently it is skewed. And, I think also I come from a place in terms of, I think having a 2-year-old and thinking about what I want him to have growing up, there's also assumptions based on, wherever you send your own child to school or the experience that you have. I suppose for me, there's certain givens in terms of what I expect from an education system, which is they will be able to read and write, and they will be able to do these, they will be able to do maths problems. And so to me, it's a case of they must do all that. That is the base expectation, alongside ensuring that their creativity isn't lost. But for me, I suppose it's very much looking at what our starting point is. And I'm lucky enough that, my little boy goes through a learning space where they have that, and it's incredible. He goes through an incredible place. But also I think there's a lot of schools that aren't actually equipped due to resources and not, I think some do struggle when it comes to offering that space and support, not through any fault of their own, but because they just don't have the tools and resources at their disposal.
how do you see the role of hybrid and online education? I mean, it's growing without a shadow of a doubt. There's a desperate need for it for various different needs, different reasons. Neurodiversity would be one example. But they seem to be offering a more and more future-oriented, future-focused sort of set of skills as well. And yet mainstream education is stuck within like a framework that restricts that in some ways. So do you think hybrid and online is going to keep growing and growing? Would you consider it for your own child?
I think it is going to keep growing because I think there is a market for it. I think there are lots of learners that don't benefit from the education system as we currently have it. I think for me personally, it would depend on the school. So it doesn't necessarily, for me, I don't think it would make a difference in terms of it being necessarily online or in person in that respect, because he would have opportunities outside of it. But I would look at what's the caliber of this school, what skills would it offer, what are the socialization opportunities, because that's one of the concerns as well when it comes to hybrid learning. And so I'd like to see how that evolves. So right now, because he's so little, then it wouldn't be something that in 10 years' time, I'm not closed off for it. It's just, how do I ensure that all of these kind of spaces are met? So when we think about not just the academic learning, but what does pastoral look like in terms of online school? I'd like to explore that because I think that's really interesting. But also, where is the space for socialisation, and what impact will that have when it comes to, him going out in the workforce, for example, or if he chose to go to university or whatever he chooses to do, how is he then going to, I suppose, communicate? So what facilities would they have online schools to ensure that they still have those communicative skills as well? So right now, because of his age, I would say not for me, but within 10 years' time, I don't know what it's going to look like.
You've mentioned 10 years' time twice there, and I'm with you on that, and I think what you've just said is very sensible. I spoke to a company that Al will know vaguely in Croatia, and they applied for EU Horizon funding for their company. And the EU Horizon funding, I think it was over 3 years, but they had to stick with what they submitted the grant for. So if they got the grant, they had to stick to whatever it was for. And they said that the biggest issue there was that things are changing that fast. That what they proposed to do at the start of year one, by the start of year two, may be completely obsolete. So when we use phrases like 10 years, because we're thinking of our kids getting through primary school and things, you think it's almost impossible to know, isn't it, what's going to happen in a couple of years, never mind 10 years. Although we do know that the education system will still have, especially in England, a focus on traditional bricks and mortar schools at the moment. I mean, how on earth are we supposed to know what a 2-year-old or even a 12-year-old, like my youngest, are going to be taught about, or what they're going to miss out on, I suppose, in 3 or 4 years, never mind 10 years. The speed of change is impossible to keep up with, I find.
Yeah, I think even if we look at, 4 years ago, if we thought that these are some of the problems we would be, or challenges that we would be grappling with, a lot of people considered it. And I think, I base it very much on it's how individual institutions are going to respond, I think, is really important. Because, when I think about 10 years is very long. I say it's a very long time. It's going to whiz past, I'm sure. But there's already schools that are responding. So, for example, for a primary school that mine was at, they're just hiring for a digital fundamentals teacher. And in the summer holidays, they have digital summer camps. And I thought, that's excellent. That's really fantastic. But then I look at it and I think, what about other schools that don't have this? Are we going to now have a huge disparity, even at the age of, when we go into secondary school, where we're going to have some who are far better equipped than others? There's going to be such a huge disparity there.
See, I would argue that when we say we can't look forward to 10 years and because of the pace of change, and I agree in some regards, but I also push back a bit and say, actually, I think we can, because I see that point on disparity you referenced, Bianca, in schools within my own MAT. You get differences in terms of the availability of staff with particular skills. You've got funding challenges, so you don't get equity across the system. And so if you look 10 years forward and you say, well, what's education going to look like? None of us have a crystal ball to be exact. But there are some common bits, which is if our aspiration is equity of access to education, it won't be more bricks and mortar buildings in more geographical places. It has to be more digital connections in the hands of learners so that they can all access the same high quality content, resources, and potentially teaching and learning. Now, that's not to say instead of everything else, but I think on a previous episode, Matt, we've discussed, I've shared that if I had the power of God and we were starting again on planet Earth, putting an education system in, just based on geography, you wouldn't start building places for learning. You would end up putting the connectivity in a device in every child's hand. And then you'd create the spaces to bring them together, that community hub, that sense of working with peers and developing a sense of themselves. So the reason why I kind of hang on that is because it doesn't matter what the curriculum is, whether we move to a hybrid curriculum, a flexible curriculum, micro-credentials, a different kind of learning, whether we push back and say, no, we want to stick on those core curriculum values that we've already had, and we want to see the EBAC as the kind of the gold standard in terms of the qualifications we want to cover, fingers crossed not, that wouldn't change the need to have a device and digital ecosystem that allowed learners equitable access, and more importantly, access to the best teachers, no matter where they were. And equally, it would allow teachers to access the fair amount of CPD and support. Now, I kind of think the problem with that is it requires a government to be forward-thinking and thinking about all the technology it needs and how they're going to fund that and how they're going to make sure that we actually redraw the message about the value of educators and the teaching profession and how people and parents should have better respect for what's happening in schools. But only on Thursday this week, I was at a lovely multi-academy trust in North London, South Essex border. And as I was going around meeting lots of folks, I met a few of the different department team. I took a little head in the door and said hello to the IT team. And on their shelf, they had probably the best part of 60 to 100 broken Chromebooks that were ones that will probably end up going in the bin. And the reason why I flagged it was because from a government level, 5 years ago, we said, pandemic, we need to make sure we mitigate the digital divide. Let's put the technology in the hand of learners. And now those devices are broken and due for refresh. The government says, I'm sorry, there's no money in the pot. We're spending it on an uplift on our defence budget. And the narrative is you can't expect that digital skills, that broader review of curriculum, everything to keep growing if we don't have a joined up approach in how we're actually going to fund and support it. I should get off my soapbox now.
No, I completely agree. I think it's very much, there needs to be sustainable approaches when it comes to digital innovation. And I think, it's when it comes to the state maintained system, I think there does need to be accountability and ownership when it comes to government, because you can't expect schools to introduce something and then not have the means and resources to carry it through. Because also, what impact is that having on the learners as well? And it also means that there's going to be a very fragmented approach. But also the concern is if you introduce this technology, you're not then supporting their learning when it comes to it as well. So let's say AI, for example. If you were to introduce AI in years 7 and 8, and then, support goes, they've got access, they've got base level of understanding, but then they have a lot of freedom to essentially use it in ways that might be irresponsible because they don't have that sustained support. And it's the same with technology as a whole. Just because you don't have then devices when it comes to school, what about when they go back home and they don't have that same support when it comes to framing it as a learning tool, for example, and instead it's very much a social tool. And that has a huge impact as well. One of the problems that I'm seeing at the moment is around Snapchat AI, which I have great issues with. But it means that before children are using AI in schools or being exposed to it as a learning tool and looking at the responsibilities and looking at the opportunities and risks, they already see it as a social partner beforehand. So essentially, when they come into the classroom, we're having to unpick and they're having to unlearn because they've already framed it in a very different way. And so we're coming at it far too late, I think.
Matt, we should get Snapchat. It sounds really cool. I'm joking. We shouldn't. Bianca, what are the top questions people reach out to you for advice on that you would say are the most frequent kind of gaps in people's understanding or the fear factors that schools have to move forward?
I think the big one is safeguarding. More than anything else, it's very much, what do we need our pupils to know? What do we need our staff to know when it comes to safety? I think a lot of people, understandably, are incredibly concerned about the limitations and whether it should be allowed in schools. So that, I would say, is the biggest one, especially because at the moment you've got all sorts of issues going on with apps that are being used, things like codes off app, and it's absolutely terrifying, and deepfake, and, it's very tricky. But not only that, you've got things coming out like AI companions and grief bot, and it's, to me, I just think it seems so it seems so peculiar. It feels a bit like a Twilight. And now recently OpenAI is partnering with Mattel, and I think, I used to play with Barbie. What on earth is an AI
Barbie AI
look like? So a lot of it is based around safety for children, and also how are staff supposed to be made aware of that?
Bianca, I don't know if you've come across Graham Brown Martin. Where he did a post last night, and I mentioned this to Al before, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but over the next 10 years, global investment in AI developments, so that'll be government, business and things, will exceed £10 trillion. Annual spending from hundreds of billions to several trillions, blah, blah, blah. At the same time, providing every human on earth with sustainable, high-quality shelter, food, water, education, and healthcare for life would require £3 trillion. Have we got our priorities really, really, really badly wrong, haven't we? So should part of education moving forward be teaching kids about things like this? When we talk about AI with them, actually, every time you ask have a chat with AI, that could be funding this. So should that be at the forefront of what we're teaching the kids?
Yeah, I think so. I think it should be a much more holistic approach than we currently have as well, and also the environmental factors, I think, are really important. Don't get me wrong, it's very much, I do believe that technology is an excellent thing, and I think it can access, and I think it can do learning. But there is a cost. There is a huge cost of innovation, which we need to be aware of, because whenever we use it, that's a decision that we're making. And I'm sure a lot of people don't realise it's a decision that they're making by using it. And so, and when we think about things such as atrophy, I was reading an article, I can't remember who by, not so long ago, and it was about the Industrial Revolution. And so after the Industrial Revolution, they were looking at muscle atrophy, because there was far less manual labour, you had machine working, what's taking place. So when we're thinking about AI, are we going to have the same thing? Is there going to be cognitive atrophy? In the same way that we had muscle atrophy with the Industrial Revolution, will this fourth Industrial Revolution do the same thing, but, to a different part of us? And I think we do need to be aware of those costs. There is a huge cost of innovation. And I think, children and adults need to be informed about this. So I think we do need to be exploring it and teaching about it.
Really interesting. I saw a post this morning that was shared by Australian teacher, educator, researcher Leon Furst that really resonated with me. And he was talking about how platforms die. And the cycle of platforms is, first they're good to their users. We've all seen that. Then they abuse their users to make things better for their business customers. And we often see that where it becomes monetized. Finally, they abuse those business customers to claw back as much value as they can for themselves. And then they die. And there is this sequence that we see so much of this. Hey, this AI is going to hook you in with all this cool stuff. And now suddenly it's going to be a pay-per use, and we're going to make it more focused around business use. And suddenly it's going to increase again. And we find that, like all these things, potentially the most beneficial tools will be out of reach of the average person. And that's the other risk. Why we're focusing on trying to put anthropomorphize, I think is the term, put that human element onto AI in a really dangerous way, with chatbots, grief bots, Barbie bots, whatever else. When actually the focus should be about where's the parity of base access. And I am customer platform agnostic in our conversations we have here. But I do know if you're a home Office 365 user, you'll find that your subscription renewal will go up 40% this year. And that's partly to offset the costs of having AI and Copilot within it. So there is this subtle shift that we are moving from the, hey, AI is the panacea to everything, to actually now it's a revenue generator for us consumers, to some organizations to really rack up their revenues. And I think that's a really important one to consider, because you change your priorities when it's about money rather than about safeguarding and the right moral purpose and all the other things that go alongside it.
Yeah, I think that takes back to things like Snapchat AI. I don't understand why a child would need access to a unmonitored companion. And if you go on their website, I haven't been on the past couple of months, but when I did go on a couple of months ago, it openly said that it cannot guarantee that the content is age appropriate, even though they say 13. And so to me, it's a case of why are you allowing children to access something that as a company you cannot guarantee, or at least even close to guarantee, that they won't be exposed to something dangerous. And I think that's astonishing that actually these, these organizations, these corporations are allowed to do that. And I think that's some of the problems as well, is we're very much being guided by tech as opposed to being guided by what's right and wrong, because we're retrospectively legislating. And I think that's where the issues are, is when it comes to safety. If safety isn't in mind when it's being built, it's a much harder time to then, post-regulate.
Absolutely. I'm conscious of time. Matt, any final questions on your list you want to unpick before we wrap things up?
I just wanted to give Bianca a chat about AI Edify, which I quite like. And if you want to say a bit more about that.
Oh, lovely. We started AI Edify not that long ago. We did, we mainly focus on responsible use. So the idea is we have teacher tools, and I am really unpopular in this term where they're not about efficiency. Don't get me wrong, they may save time, that's fantastic. But it's all about how to use technology to essentially deepen your learning. So for example, we do have lesson planners, but the lesson planners don't give you an answer. They give you options, which you then have to go in and edit and choose what you want from it. We have lesson plan evaluators where you put in your lesson plan and it will evaluate it and it'll say, well, these are your strengths, these are your areas of development. We've got a tool which is Clarify and Challenge, where you put in any topic, and yes, it will simplify, but also there's an option to take the concepts and ask you questions about those to challenge more. So it's based on what I feel is good about our teaching practices and how to distill that into something that would help in terms of, yes, a little bit of time, but actually making you think deeper about what you're teaching and how I can improve my practice. And then as well as that, we do consultancy, we do webinars, but it's very much about being teacher-led and doing something responsibly, because ultimately I'm basing it on my practice. And if it's not something that I would use, it's not something I would feel comfortable doing at all. So it's very much a response to, I don't like lesson plan generators that give you an answer, because I think, well, what about my class? What about what I know about them? What about their differentiation? So no, I don't want that. What I would love to have is something that provided me options that I could tinker with and that I can put in little tick boxes, and I can say, these are the people in my class, this is their ability levels, this is what I can respond to, and I can go in and I can embed it and tinker. That's what I want to do as an educator. And so that's what we've built.
Okay, brilliant.
I like that. Iterate away. That's always the way. But it's interesting. There's quite a lot of people pushing back now in the right reasons and just kind of focusing on that. If somebody else or a tool creates your lesson resources, how can you effectively teach it? It might give you some of the bits you want to weave in, but it still relies on that human element, start and finish of that journey. Matt, obviously Bianca shared a lovely summary there, encapsulating some of the bits. Where would folks reach out to you, Bianca, if they wanted to find out more or were concerned rightly around safeguarding the technology in their schools or wanted some teacher training?
So our website is www.aiedify.com, or just a message on LinkedIn as well, which I tend to live on now.
It's kind of the home for a lot of us, isn't it? But it's a safer home than X and other places, let's be honest. Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. Really appreciate you giving up your time, coming and joining us. When it comes to safeguarding and challenging the role of some of these new tools, some are good and some are not so good. Thank you. Keep flying the flag, keep challenging. I don't think we can challenge enough. So it's really important to have those rooted in evidence and practice challenging voices. So big thank you, Bianca.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And thank you.